Hello, everybody. So today we'll be talking about the navigation system inside Unity, and then we're going to have another lecture on Friday that can cover the actual states and getting introduced to a state machine and the state machine pattern in general. So there are a couple of assignments associated with the navigation system here for this first week. There's an ILA, which is going to be a discussion about just general navigation in 3D games, not specific for an engine or anything like that. Then there is a Unity navigation system, which will be covering most of the content in here for today, but I would recommend taking a look at some of these videos just in case they touch on something that I didn't cover or vice versa. There's also really great resources in O'Reilly's ebook stuff. I did get a notification that some of you may have lost access due to some weird things going on with O'Reilly. They were apparently having some issues transferring data over. If you do run into any problems logging into O'Reilly, feel free to reach out and I can get you a number directly to have them reset your account. But so we'll be digging into the actual Unity navigation system. There is an assignment associated with this worth 10% for the class overall. And the assignment will walk you through the several different prerequisites to check in or just touch on that we'll be using throughout the week, and some more reference links along with the assignment documentation. In here, it'll kind of walk you through how to get a navigation, basic patrol NPC set up. We'll be doing it live as well, but you will just need to follow along with this. And as for the submission of this assignment, you will need to take a screenshot, and we'll be using this basically as a checklist going straight down for the grading on this. So make sure that you, when you do take the screenshot, compare it against this list and make sure that everything is shown that is needed in one screenshot. And an example below of how it should be, how it should look when completed. All right, so without further ado, let's hop over to Unity and set up a basic patrolling AI, or patrolling NPC rather. For this, we're going to need some sort of ground and things to walk around on. So we're going to add a 3D object. We'll go with terrain so we can play around with it a little bit more versus just a static plane. The default terrain, when you create it, it will be huge, and it has 0, 0, 0 as the bottom left corner of the terrain. I like to work with 0, 0, 0 being in the middle of a map. So we're going to change a couple of things on this terrain. In the terrain component itself, we're going to click over here on the terrain settings. And in here, there's several different options that we want to change. The width and height, or width and length, 1,000 units is pretty big. We just need a little test playground. So let's go 50 by 50. And I mentioned that I wanted it centered. So center of 50 would be, let's offset it in the position X, minus 25, and position Z, minus 25 as well. So I did create just a simple checker here. I know it does come with the default terrain material, but just showing you that you can swap out what material it's using to draw the terrain. We'll just check out that checkerboard texture that I made. In the materials themselves, you can specify how many tiles it'll have. As we see, my checkerboard pattern, super basic, just very tiny, only 4 little squares. So we can adjust how many times it gets tiled if we want more tiling or less tiling, things like that right in this custom material. Then let's move on to adding a character to this. For that, we'll go to game object. We'll create a capsule for our character. I want it to start on the ground. So let's just 0 the X and Z, and the Y, we'll push it up 1 unit so it's not partially in the ground, since we have our cylinder with the 2 end caps of a radius of 1. All right. Then I'm going to rename it so I don't forget, and having our character named capsules not too great. Let's call it just NPC for non-player character. We'll need a script to control this NPC. I'm going to create C# script. We'll just call it NPC as well.
Professor.
Yes.
Real quick. Oh, there's the material. Okay, never mind. I found it.
Okay. Yeah, that is on the terrain under the settings, and right down here under basic terrain material.
Okay.
And feel free to use whatever material you want.
The other one that's further down, that's on the collider. That's the deals with like friction and stuff like that, right?
Yes, that would be the physics material associated with it. So how much friction it has. If you have like an icy spot, you can have a terrain data painted on with an icy friction thing. So, but we won't be worrying about that. We'll just be using a lot of the default stuff. All right. So we've got a new script added. Visual Studio detected the change. I'm going to make sure to open up that new script though. And NPC. For our NPCs to navigate around, we need to use the navigation system. And sounds like somebody was trying to join. There we go. So for this, on this script, I'm going to use something that you might not have seen before. I'm going to say that for this class, we are going to require a component. And the type of component we are requiring is going to be a nav mesh agent. And we see my IntelliSense detected that that's from unityengine.ai. So if I let autofill fill this in, it added that using statement for me. If it does not and doesn't show you like the IntelliSense for this, make sure that you do add this using statement so we have access to all the AI types. So with this require component, anytime we attach this script to an object, it'll make sure that it has that component and even prevent that component from being removed. So it's just a safety check if you know you're going to be using a specific type of component in the script. It can come in really handy and make your workflow a bit easier from the Unity editor. So in here, we'll grab a reference to that component. Nav mesh, we'll just call it nav, initialize to null, so we can grab it inside start. Nav will get the component from our game object of nav mesh agent. All right. With the nav mesh agent component, if we look at what type of functions we have, let's look for set destination is going to be the main one that you can use to tell it to move to a specific location. We see it's taking in a vector 3. I'm going to just say we want this to try and move to a 0 vector. And I know my character is starting out at 0, but we'll move that around and make sure that it is running this. So just these 2 lines of code should be able to get it moving. Let's take a look at in Unity. So our MPC right now does not have a nav mesh agent component on it. But because I told it this script that it requires that component, when we add it, it'll also add that required component for us. You can add it the old-fashioned way, but just wanted to show you that required component because that comes in super handy if you forget to add it and then you run the game and get component returned null and you try and access it. Just saves a hassle saying, yeah, I want that. All right.
I'm getting an error. So I did the required component type of nav mesh, and I'm getting an error from it. Did I do it in the right spot?
Nav mesh agent.
Oh, okay. I see. I see what I did wrong. The bracket is in the wrong spot.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
All right.
nav mesh agent. Now agent is being upset.
If it doesn't detect that type, make sure that you have the using statement added. My IntelliSense popped up with that, so it automatically added it, but every once in a while, depending on how much code your project has searched through, might not detect it automatically.
That's what it was. Yes. Okay, I got that part then.
All right. So back over to our Unity, talking about the nav mesh agent component. You can have different agent types and things. By default, the navigation system does not build nav meshes for the different types, so you have to look into a different system. We'll talk more about that when we go to bake the nav mesh. And then there's a bunch of different settings for this specific agent. How fast it's going to go, how fast it can turn, how quickly it gets up to its max speed, how long does it take to stop, a radius, a height, all very useful things for tweaking. We'll just use it all by default at first. And let's take a look at what happens. And I see all our basic code running. We still have that script attached to our camera. I'm going to just disable that so we're just looking at our new script. When we play, an error can only be called on an active agent that has been placed on a nav mesh. So we put the nav mesh agent component on there, but we never actually built a nav mesh. For that, we're going to go to Window, and under the AI section, it's quite extensive, so make sure you select the right one. We're going with Navigation. Should open up a new navigation window to basically define what areas are walkable. There's several different tabs up here. The agent that you're going to be baking for, the different areas, types that you can have. As you can see, there's a lot of user options in case you have swimming or flying or anything like that that would be considered part of navigation. An option to bake, as well as an object section. So when you're in here, you can use these scene filters or just select the things you want from this from the hierarchy. If we check out the terrain, we do see it is set to static. It's supposedly generating off mesh links, but we don't have much geometry in here, as well as the navigation area is set to walkable. What we need to do is actually bake our nav mesh. So for that, let's select all renders there, and I see what's going on. And bake, I can't click bake because I'm currently playing the game. I was wondering why that was grayed out, but when you're not playing, yes, you can bake. So let's bake a nav mesh, and we should see a nav mesh get baked for the walkable area. Walkable will be in blue. We see it is back a little bit from the edge all the way around our mesh. Reason for that? Well, that's our agent radius right here, set to 0.5. So it pulls in the nav mesh saying the agent can get to like right here, but not all the way to the edge because it has width and it doesn't want to hang off the edge halfway or anything like that. If we were to pump that up and make our nav agent a little bit fatter, we see it pulls it back even further. But 0.5 is perfect since that's the default radius of this guy. All right. So now with it baked, when we try and play, you see, pulled it out of the ground a little bit. Pull my other camera over here. And didn't really move because we told it to go basically to 0, 0, 0 where it already was. So let's swap back over to this. Switch over to the move tool and pull it off 0, 0, 0 for a little bit. If we press play now, we see it is actually navigating. All right. I'm going to clear out that selection, and when our nav agent is selected, we can choose other debug options to show, whether it's showing the path polygons. And if we wanted to, say, take a screenshot for the turn-in, I would recommend playing, then pausing your game. It should show the actual path of the agent and like its destination point of where it was told to go. So keep that in mind. You can always pause to get a better view of the scene. I think one of the requirements is that you show the entire scene view and that it does show the actual path the agent is following. Your game view should also be showing, and I would recommend just a top-down view for this. So let's change up our camera a little bit. Camera. I'm going to swap over to the inspector. Let's place it right at the center of our level. Bring it up maybe 10 units. Might need to go a little bit bigger than that, but we'll start there for now. And we're going to rotate it around the x-axis, 90 degrees, so it's facing straight down. Let's bump it up to 20. Even further would be fine. 30. That looks close enough. All right. So when we play, we should see it in here. Keep in mind that you have to have the navigation tab open to see the debug drawing and stuff. One other thing is, if for whatever reason it doesn't show the agent's path when you have the NPC selected, go ahead and just close out of your scene tab. And definitely don't need the asset store because that's already been moved and useless. You can open another scene just by going to Window, General, Scene, and it should reset to all the default stuff so that all the debug rendering should work again. All right.
Professor, a few questions. How did you center the terrain again?
So on the terrain itself,
Yeah,
the
well, was
inspector,
it? Yeah, was that just something or that you just moved yourself, or is there an actual setting for that?
no, I just moved the position. So I
Okay.
first did the width and length of the terrain to 50-50, and then just typed in position of -25 and -25 in the Z, so it puts the center directly in at 0, 0.
Oh, okay. And then what was the last line of code in the start to actually get the nav to move?
That's using the navigation component. We're telling it to set a destination, and right now we just have it hard-coded to 0. So basically telling it move to the center of the map.
So that's kind of similar to kind of how like when we do our transform, like we're
Yeah, it just takes in a vector 3 of like an actual position. Obviously, hard-coding it to 0's not great, and we'll be changing that to go to a specific point of some items that we place down in the level.
okay.
Yeah, that was just to make
I
sure it
have a
was
question.
moving. Yes, certainly.
If you place anything between the NPC and the destination, will it move around that, or do you have to actually code that in?
That is our next step that we'll be testing out. So
Oh, okay,
good
cool.
transition. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see what happens when we do place something there. Let's go ahead and add just let's go with a cube, and we'll make a makeshift wall real quick. We'll rename it to wall, and we'll scale it up. Make it a bit wider, a bit taller. That looks like a good wall to block our character. Move it around so that it's basically right in front of our character, preventing it from going to the center. If we just press play, we'll see our character does just walk straight through it. Now that's because our navigation mesh, we need to tell it that this wall is not a walkable area, and we also have to rebake our nav mesh. So in the object section with the wall selected, we'll say it is static and that it is not walkable. Sorry, I didn't mean to play. And the last thing, we can bake our nav mesh again. And we should see that nav mesh actually pull back from the wall. You can see it's actually got a cutout in it around the wall. So if we press play now, you see it is routing around. So it is navigating. It's not just move straight to this position. It's finding the path of least resistance, essentially. All right. So next up, let's take a look at, rather than having it just hard-coded to 0, I want something to be able to place some points around and have it kind of patrol continuously through those points. Let's create an object for that. We'll just do a simple sphere. And we'll place that kind of just near the ground. I'm going to rename this to nav point. In the inspector, I'm going to set it so rather than being a collider and have physics on it and stuff, we will just be a trigger. So when our character hits it, it'll have that on trigger enter message. Let's go ahead and attach a script to this so we can easily identify it. You typically never want to do any like identification straight through the name, because there could be nav point sub 1, nav point sub 2, and if we can just attach a blank script to it and identify it that way through the code, that'll be easier. Let's create a new C# script. We'll just call it nav point. Open that script up. And I literally want no code in this other than a class. So anything that we attach this script to will have the nav point as a component. All right. So just cleared out the start and update. And we can hop back over to Unity. I'm going to drag that script onto our nav point so that it does have it attached as a component. And for now, let's just set it kind of over there. Let's get our agent moving towards, or our NPC moving towards this nav point. So for that, we'll just start out with the one nav point for now, get it moving to that specific location, and then add more in an array and things like that. We'll take a slow evolution to it. For this, I need a reference to a nav point. We'll just call it point and initialize to null. But I want to be able to set this in the editor. So we will make this field serialized. All right. So rather than the destination being set to 0 now, we'll ask our point for its transform dot position. Save that. I do want to make sure to assign this in the editor. So that's going to be important. Otherwise, we'll get a null reference for not having it assigned. So on our NPC, we have to select a nav point. Since we do have that as a type of nav point, it'll look through the actual scene for any nav points we have. We just have the one, so we'll assign it right there. Press play, and we see it moves to that point. We can move that point around wherever we want. And because it just does it on start, we'll see it actually move to that new position.
Oh, Professor, is the NPC currently supposed to be able to go through walls? Have you done anything about that?
No. So we actually went to our navigation, selected our wall, and told it that the wall is not walkable. And then in bake, we had to rebake to actually bake around that area.
It's grayed out for me. Do I need to do static or?
For our object, yeah, you have to select the wall, make sure that it is static so we can say what type it is, not walkable. All right.
Thank you.
So our agent.
Professor, I do have a question.
Certainly.
When if we implement environments like buildings and like roads, like say we make like a little highway or ramp, right? We can make it so that that is a walkable area, correct? Using the nav mesh?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
We'll actually be digging into that a little bit. I just want to get the patrol basically working first, and then we'll add some ramps, even a second floor to our terrain and or to our level and everything.
Cool.
Yep. So we will, since we are just covering the nav agents today, I can go a little bit further in detail versus the just general quick portion. All right. So got it moving to that point. Let's say we wanted multiple of these points. For that, I'm going to make a quick prefab out of this so we can place some more throughout the level. Let's go with 4. That'll be fine. Then over in our script for our NPC, rather than just having the single point, we want to make this an array, and we'll change it from point to points. We have to change how the set destination's working. I want to track which index of the array we're actually going to, int per nav index. Start that out at 0. So that when we tell it to set a destination for our start, we'll have it go to, well, our current nav index. Go to that position. And then I want something to happen when it hits one of the nav points or detects a collision with it. Don't need any update for our character, but we will look for on trigger enter. On trigger enter, we have a detection of the other collider that we're hitting. We'll check if that other object has a specific component. In this case, we'll be looking for our nav point component. We would want to tell it to go to the next nav point. So we could say current nav index plus plus. Problem is, we'll actually leave that as is, and we will tell it to move to its next point. So copying that same code, because this index now has changed on line 27, it'll be updating to the new point. You can save that. And in our level, got to remember to assign those different new points to our NPC. We now have an array. We can tell it how many we want. Let's just go with 4. We'll select them. Let's go nav point 1, nav point 2, and nav point 3. Oops. So as it goes through, we should see it go to this one first, and nothing happened. So our on trigger enter should be telling it to increment and go to the next nav point position. We have one problem with this. On trigger enter is never firing. We watch this and try and debug it. Yes, allow the debugging. And we play. We see very clearly that they are overlapping. Our nav point itself is set as a trigger. Problem is, triggers don't just send messages to all colliders. One thing I would recommend, basically bookmarking or something, is the Unity manual for colliders. Gives a great explanation of how colliders and rigid bodies and things should be working for the different objects. Typically anything you have in your game that will be moving should have a rigid body component with it. That would be considered a kinematic rigid body controller. And down here, when it is talking about static colliders versus kinematic, the static it's referring to is not the static option right here. That is just for light baking. The static it is referring to is this object. Well, this one is static because we do not have a rigid body on it. So we're basically telling Unity we didn't really want this moving through the level. But our NPC has a collider and all that stuff, but no rigid body. So we'll also add a rigid body component to it. One thing when I do add this rigid body, I do not want physics on it. I don't want the physics messing up with the navigation. So we can check it for is kinematic. So that can come in really handy, especially if you have multiple agents when they push into each other. If you don't have is kinematic, the physics system will actually be applying impulses and momentums to them. So when they're not colliding with anything, they may end up just floating off into the level or having some odd behavior because the rigid body controller or rigid body would be fighting with our nav mesh agent that's trying to get it to move. So now with the rigid body, if we play.
Just a quick question. For the objects we create with ProBuilder, we would have to remove the original collider, correct, and replace it? Because I know the stuff you make with ProBuilder, the collider will actually interfere with the kinematic.
Possibly. I don't have a direct answer for you right now, but I will look into that and try and follow up with you. If you can, shoot me a message on Discord or FSO so that I can follow through with that.
Question.
Yes.
Though you might like, what if you have a point overlap the path of another point?
We will be talking about that, and we'll take a look at that in a moment.
Okay.
Yep. So we do see it's now getting this message. So we'll remove the breakpoint, just let our code continue running, and it is going to each point and moving around. But we now have an issue. Index out of range. So it's outside the bounds of the array. It hit all 4 points and then stopped because we're getting an error. The error is basically saying, well, we were at the end of the array and we tried to access past the end of it. We're outside those bounds. What we can do is, wherever we're modifying it, we can check if it is within bounds. So we just modified the current nav index. We'll be checking if current nav index is greater than or equal to the length of our array, our points.length. If that is the case, we'll make it loop back to the beginning of the array. And that's as simple as saying current nav index, start at the very first index. So we'll just set that back to 0. So we'll save that. We'll take a look at this. If we play again, should see it go through all the nav points. And after it hits that last one, should go to the first one. Yep. So we've got our AI patrolling. Cool. But let's take a step further. Somebody had just mentioned like what happens if there's another nav point in the way of its path. Let's test that out. Let's go ahead and duplicate this nav point, Control D. Move a camera around, and we'll put that kind of like right there, which is about the path that it'll take. And it should try, and very first nav point is still set to this one, so it should try and go straight there. If we press play, we see it hits that nav point and didn't even touch the nav point it was going to. And we see some really odd behavior of it ping-ponging back and forth as it was trying to touch the other nav points. So our on-trigger enter check is just looking if it hits any nav point. Well, we can add some more specifics to this. We can say, if we hit a nav point, an object with a nav point component, and that other nav point component it's hitting is equal to the one we're currently navigating to. Our point sub current nav index will give us our nav point back, and this other one is the specific one it's hitting. So now both of these have to be true in order for it to try and move to the next nav point. Oh, don't need to attach, we're not debugging right now. So now if we play, should ignore any extra nav points that aren't the ones that we told it to navigate directly to. So can go straight through that and make sure that it is going to the nav points we told it. All right. So that's the basics of getting our navigation working. Let's take a look if we had a bit more complex level, and let's play around with some of this stuff. So I do have a terrain. I could play around with some of the nav tools. And yeah, sure. Whoa, that was quite a big jump there, but as we can see, let's do a little bit softer for some other edges. Oh, geez, it lagged and did a whole bunch, but let's create kind of like a mountain range on the edge. And bump that up a bit more. And we'll have this plateau here. Let's just make a bit of a smooth hump here. I'm gonna drop its opacity so it's not quite as big. And then let's add like a ramp and even like a secondary level or a bridge going across, things like that. For that, I need to get rid of that tool. Select, we'll duplicate this and place a couple more of them around. We'll rename this to ramp. Move it around. Actually lay it down and ramp it up. And just to make sure that it is touching, doesn't have to be perfect, but duplicate it again. Get that right there. And that might be a little high. We can adjust the levels later. Duplicate again. We'll balance this one out. And we'll duplicate this one more time. Well, even one step further. And we'll rotate that a bit more. There's a reason why I'm not an artist. So we've got this weird bridge looking thing going around there. Let's see what happens when we put our nav points a bit different. Let's see, this was our first nav point. Let's have it go up the ramp. Oh, and I placed it way inside the hump. Bring that up over there. Let's place our second nav point, which I believe was this one, under our ramp. And let's place this third one just on the other side of the hump. Next up, we need to go to our navigation tab, and obviously our nav mesh still thinks it's just the original nav mesh. That won't be playing too well. Let's look at the different ramp objects. I do want to make sure that these ramps are set as walkable. And then let's go ahead and bake. We see it is set at a 45-degree angle. It can, or incline, it can go up, and it can step over little jumps that are 0.4 high, or steps. Let's see what a bake does. Did bake all the areas that we can walk around. Obviously, we shouldn't be really walking right up there. That got a little bit steeper, so let's drop our slope angle a little bit. Try and clean up our nav mesh so we can't really walk up sides of the mountains and things. 38, let's see, drop it even further, just staying in the valley area. All right, let's hit play and see what goes on. Should be going to the first nav point, which is on top of the thing up here. And it hit it, and now it's going to the one underneath our bridge, hitting that far one, and then we'll be back over to this one over here. So keep that in mind. You can build navigable areas on top of other navigable areas, and it'll take that all into account when it does the baking portion. One thing I do want to mention about the baking, as I first led to, you can only have one agent baked at a time, unless you work with this component workflow that there's a link built in right into the bake tab here for. That gets a lot further in detail about the navigation system and has a whole bunch of extra additional modifiers and allows for baking at runtime, things like that. So if you did want to go further with it and not just use the built-in system, there are additional packages and explanation of how to set that up component-wise.
Is there a limit to the size of the nav mesh?
Not that I have found. I mean, ultimately, you would probably have just different nav meshes per area, and you can link those up using off-mesh links to have one mesh linked to another, and you can have it just do a walk or a jump over that area, things like that, to have connections between two things.
Okay. And my secondary question is, if you make a nav mesh too large, will it affect the actual frames per second or the speed?
I mean, it'll all have a bit of impact on the performance. The more complex your game is, the slower it's going to run. So there's certain things you would probably want to take a look at, like, do you even need to define that big of an area as a nav mesh? As there are certain things that you're marking to be considered walkable that don't need to be, or could have been just blocked out with just a simple wall or invisible trigger volume, things like that. But so far it's written quite well and performs pretty well with many different nav agents moving around and even on larger levels and things. But if it does get too big for one area, you can always split that up into multiple nav meshes.
Well, Professor, so well, about with the performance, like something I do notice, like it's sending out a bunch of rays, I would probably call it, right? Just to identify.
Yeah, so on that, the biggest one that you'd probably want to focus on, for example, if we check this guy and have it look, the triangles it's actually pathing with are all pre-baked. That's why we have to bake the nav mesh. It does do some obstacle avoidance and things like that by default. So on our NPC in the inspector, our nav mesh does have like a quality for obstacle avoidance. Let's say we had a pillar right here, and that pillar wasn't necessarily marked as not walkable, but it should try and avoid it, so it'll go to the other edge. It'll detect that in the area. You can change that quality and things like that right here. If we wanted no obstacle avoidance, we could select that.
Yeah, because like I noticed like the as it's walking around, it has borders, like these purple borders that appear when it comes to like a non-walkable area.
Yep,
It has these like purple borders that come up.
yep. There are. That's the obstacle avoidance there, probably.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's probably because I also have the everything displayed.
Okay. Yeah.
That is why I'm seeing this.
So it does a lot of math for you to try and get that nav agent moving to where you told it to. So it, depending on what you tweak, you can change it around to be less performance intensive. But I would honestly say don't ever worry about performance until you start seeing it uh, as a limitation and need to optimize.
All right, all right. Is like and these are things that a lot of studios are using. Like the navigation is something that's very commonly used then.
Yeah, almost every engine has some sort of navigation system built in. They're slightly different. For example, in Unreal, you define where the nav mesh area is by dropping in a nav mesh bounds volume, and versus this one where you're selecting per object where you want it to check, things like that. So there's a lot of different setups for it, but they all basically accomplish the same thing of getting something pathing, actually determining the best route and things like that for
Okay.
where you need
Th-
it to go.
Man, this looks a lot simpler than what I've looked in the past because I think some of us have actually done AI before.
Okay.
Um, so I haven't. I was always under the assumption that you're using just a whole bunch of rays,
You
which
can do it that way, just and there's a tool that's built in that's really nice for you.
oh my God,
Yeah.
there's a tool. Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Alrighty. So that was the general gist of it. And Nicholas, I pulled up the script for you. Did you need to? Did you have any questions about anything in there, or?
No, I missed the nav point, not the NPC script.
Oh, nav point is really simple. I got
Oh
rid of
my
the start and
god.
update. Yep. That was the
Okay,
only
cool.
thing I did in it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
No
you
problem.
just need a reference script or like something to reference, a component to reference.
Yeah, a specific component that I can look up. So when our nav agent hits something, we can say, do you have this component? If you do, is it the one we're looking for? Then we'll move on to our next nav point.
See, there was another question I had, and that's just a little bit about arrays. Is can you define? Are you able to at the very beginning, like in code, determine the amount of points there are, and then set the size of the array to that amount? But you still run into the issue is like the points would just auto um,
So
populate the
you're
array.
asking like how can we auto-populate it versus having it like a serialized field?
Yes.
We can do that. I show the serialized field because that's required for the screenshot.
Yeah. Oh,
But
okay. Okay.
if we wanted it to just go find all the nav points in the level, we can simply say points equals GameObject.find, and we can look for objects of a certain type. Nav point. Now, you typically don't want to do this, and especially with like a patrol route that we're setting up specifically, because this will find and it won't find objects of type to return the array. And we don't need the game object. Cool. Can just call that directly. You typically don't want to do that because it'll just return whatever order it wants for the patrol points. And you typically want to have more control from in the editor perspective of saying, I want it to go to this one first, then this one, and so on, etc. But this would find all of the nav points. Let's save that. And left it running. So if we watch in the inspector, our NPC script, NPC script has no way to set the points. Switch that over to debug version real quick. Come on, inspector. Why are you doing this to me? Scroll up and then switch it. So switch the inspector to debug mode, and we do see our points array is there, just empty. But on start, it'll find it and set all of the points. Oops, and it didn't. Did I not save that script?
No, we have it in the wrong spot. We need to put it above the.
Oh, because I was using the points array right there. Darn it. Yeah, good call.
Yeah, we need to put it above it.
Yeah, I need to have the points filled out before I can use it. Hopping back over. Now when we play, we see it does auto-populate just in whatever order it found.
See, that's interesting. Is that based off in the hierarchy then?
Not really. As we can see, the first point it added was number 4. That's down here.
Yeah, because for me, it added 3, 2, 1 than the original.
Then 3, 2, 1 and the original. Like, it's not guaranteed to be based on how you have it laid out in the hierarchy. As we can see here, mine isn't, and it didn't find it.
But that would be more useful just collecting data rather than like having like a set path. You said like we want more control with the set path, but like if we need to collect a bunch of data.
Yeah, if you need to ever reference just an entire group of objects, we'll be talking about that in week 3 when we're building our manager for our agents. I will probably use that just to grab all the agents in the scene and then add it to the array.
All right. Yeah, thanks for answering that. That was something I had I was curious about.
Yep. Glad to help out. Alrighty. So that brings us to the end of today's session. And just a reminder, on Friday, we'll be taking a look at the state machine intro. We'll be doing a quick blurb about that. And one thing I want to mention before we go, Monday is actually a holiday, Memorial Day or Labor Day, one of those. So I will be pushing our the scripting tutorials and scripting tutorials test due date to that Wednesday, so we can have an intermediate review on the Wednesday lecture. All right. Other than that, are there any questions about anything we went over today or previously? Or?
Besides now messing with this.
Yeah, definitely have some fun with it. One for the screenshot. Yes. What would you like to know about that? Oh. Yes, this will be uploaded to YouTube just after this session and after it finishes processing. Limitation I mentioned about the navigation tab, our bake can only bake for one specific agent type at a time, but the component workflow shows a way of baking for different agent types and things like that. If you do have like a big boss enemy that wants to use navigation, it shouldn't be using the same navigation mesh as like the general enemies or something.
It would, yeah, it sounds a little bit more complicated. It would be like its own array or something.
It's a little bit more complicated. It's just not using this bake tab right here. You would generally be like attaching different objects for the different areas of the terrain, of different nav meshes, things like that, and nav mesh modifier volumes. It goes a lot more in depth than just using the pre-built system.
All right, all right.
And Ryan, you'll follow up with me in a minute. All right. So thank you for joining again, and hope you enjoyed it and had some fun playing around with the different stuff and making your agents cool and having a lot of fun with it. All righty. Later on, everyone.